We will go ahead and get started. Again, we are so glad that you can be with us today for supporting independent reading. We're excited to share some of what we hope are practical ideas that can help you as you begin preparing for this school year. So I am here today and I'm thrilled to be partnering with one of my very favorite colleagues in the whole world, Judy. She is the library and instructional technology consultant here at RISA. And she's also a great person to follow on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, follow Judy for instructional technology tidbits. She's always sharing great book titles and all sorts of great information. So if you're a Twitter fan, make sure you're following her there. And I'm Michelle Wagner, one of the literacy consultants at Wayne RISA. As we get started today, we just want to anchor everything we do in that idea of really thinking about the whole child. So we know that when we think about what children need, we need to make sure that we're thinking about more than just what we're seeing in our classroom, but really taking the time to get to know our students. I'll give you just a second to read this quote from A Nation at Risk to a Nation at Hope. And I hope that you agree with this, that this isn't just something we say. It's not just lip service. It's something that we truly believe that we must focus on the whole child. And when we think about the whole child being our focus, it leads us right into what we're doing with independent reading, because independent reading truly is good for the whole child. So let's just take a second and really think about what comes to mind when you think of independent reading. So if you could just use the chat to maybe throw an idea or two in there about what comes to your mind when you think about independent reading. Judy, if you wouldn't mind just sharing some of what you're seeing.
Certainly. We're seeing some dear time, some self-selected reading, students curled up with a book of their choice, another couple books of their choice. Kids reading in an authentic way.
Awesome. And I think those harken back to even what I remember from my own childhood, that idea of SSR right after lunch. We'd come back and we'd all have a book and we'd all read it quietly while the teacher worked at her desk. There was always that part of our day that was devoted to independent reading. But then I think about my own teaching experience and giving students time to read and how that may have looked different. As we go through today, we're going to think about all of those ideas that were put into the chat, as well as really reflecting on what research tells us about independent reading. I wanted to let you know that a lot of what we're doing is anchored in this text, No More Independent Reading Without Support. And this is actually a book we will be doing a virtual book study with this year. So if you're interested in being part of that book study, we will drop a link in the chat right now for you to fill out a form just to let us know that you're interested so we can get you a copy of that book. And if you're watching this later, please feel free to find the link in the comments below and we will make sure to include you as well. So when we think about independent reading in our classrooms, we're trying to really change the way in which we view this to be more like the boy that you see really engaged in the reading and less of that maybe disengaged student who's using it as a time to catch up on sleep or to daydream about the day. We're really trying to change it to something that students are actively engaged in. So for the purpose of today, when we talk about independent reading, we're going to take all of those ideas that we may have had from either our own classroom experience as children, or even what we may do in our own classrooms today. And we're really going to think about independent reading as time students spend reading self-selected texts. So for our purposes today, that's what we mean when we say independent reading. It's time that students are engaged in reading books or texts that they pick. So when we think about this, when we think about what students need in order to grow as independent readers, they need time. And I know that seems rather simple, and it is, but it's true. We have to provide the time for students to actually participate, to be a part of independent reading. We also need to make sure that we're giving students choice in what they read. And here's the real heart of everything that we do. We need to make sure that we're providing explicit instruction regarding why and how readers read. We need to make sure that they're able to read a lot, that they have access to texts. This is a big one. Not all students do have access to a variety of texts. We need to make sure that as teachers, we're monitoring, assessing, and supporting students during this process, and that we're giving them opportunities to talk about what they're reading. It's so important to build everything on that foundation of talk so that they can share what it is that they're hearing and reading. So when we think about that, is it worth it? Is it worth it for us to spend valuable instructional time on independent reading? And obviously, if you're in this session, you probably agree with me in that it is worth it. Let's talk a little bit about why it might be worth it. So what do our standards say? When we look at the Michigan K-12 ELA standards, you can see independent reading really is built right into those standards. This is kind of a magnified view there of number 10. I'll give you a second to read that. If we are asking our students to read and comprehend complex texts independently and proficiently, we have to provide them with time. So when I think about that, when I think about, okay, so the standards say we should do it, I think about all of the things that I like to call the but what abouts, those pieces that any teacher knows, hey, but this comes up or that comes up. So this section I've titled the but what about. So but what about addressing motivation and engagement, because we know that there are going to be students who come to us and instead of independent reading, they might be texting or sleeping, or perhaps they are daydreaming or looking at the task as more of a checklist of compliance. I'm doing this because the teacher says I have to, 20 minutes every day. Here's my reading log, or whatever it might be. So how can we address those students? So what about those kids in our classroom? How can we motivate and engage them? So I want to give you a chance just to hear a story from Dave Pilkey. It's only about 90 seconds, but it really goes through his journey of becoming a successful reader. And as you're listening to Dave Pilkey, I'd like you to think about your own childhood experiences with reading, perhaps some of those comments you put in the chat earlier. Think about those as you're listening to Dave share a story. And please feel free to add to the chat at any time during our presentation today. We want to start making those explicit connections between what we're covering and then what's already being done in your classrooms. So as we move forward, I want to give you about 3 minutes to really dive into the literacy essentials, specifically literacy essential number 1, which is deliberate, research-informed efforts to foster literacy, motivation, and engagement within and across lessons. When I think about independent reading and that goal of providing choice and space for students to really explore, I feel like this essential really captures it perhaps better than any other. I also, I know Judy threw into the chat for you both a link to the K3 essentials and the 4-5 essentials. So if you would prefer to look at the 4-5 essentials, number 1 is also focused on motivation and engagement in the 4-5 document. Let's just take 3 minutes to read through essential 1. Feel free to highlight words that jump out at you. Judy, I'm going to pause and just ask maybe if you wouldn't mind just sharing some of what you're seeing in the chat, both from maybe connections to the Dave Pilkey video, as well as connections to this literacy essential.
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few that are supporting that whole idea of the power of talk and how we, even as adults, we read by what's recommended to us, and kids do the same. So that energy that we pass on, kids take onto that, and the power of choice, daily opportunities, having kids seeing themselves as successful readers and writers. Again, choices, finding the purpose, being able to talk about what they're reading, having that buy-in and that general overall enthusiasm and excitement for reading, and avoiding incentivizing outside of reading related incentives.
Great, thank you. Lots of great ideas there. And I think in some ways it's really powerful that Dave Pilkey is the one to share this message of encouraging students to read what they want, because I think back to all the times that I've heard teachers say, oh, you can't read that, and often in reference to Dave Pilkey's book. And I'm certainly not advocating that any child just read a single author or a single kind of book. We want kids to read a wide variety of authors and genres. But just being mindful of the messages we send to students, I think it's really powerful. So when we think about realistic ways to really build motivation and engagement, there are some things as teachers that we can do. The first of which is building stamina. We can't expect our kindergartners to come in and be able to spend 30 minutes silent reading. That doesn't make sense. They haven't learned how to do that yet. They have to build their stamina. So just creative ways to really get students' eyes and minds on text, encouraging them to find books that they can and that they want to read. How important that is. Another great way to build engagement and motivation for students, and this is one that kind of came up in the chat already, in that we pick books that people recommend to us. We can do book talks. In their simplest form, it can just be a teacher sharing, class, you won't believe the story I just finished reading. It is about this pigeon that wants to drive a bus. And just encouraging students, telling them that little snippet, that little preview, that funny anecdote, and then maybe following it up with, I just got this book. I'm going to put it up here on the chalkboard. And if you would like to read it, you can definitely come up and borrow it from me, and make sure you put it back so someone else can read it when you're done. And I guarantee you that book won't be there 5 minutes into your independent reading time, because they do want to read what we're reading. So that's, in its simplest form, just a teacher explaining how great a book is. We also, this is from many of us on this call right now. As I look at the names, I know are fans of Jennifer Saravello's work. I want to give you just a moment to read this quote from her, where she talks about doing this idea of a book talk in a small group. So not every book will be a great book for every child. But if you can pull those small groups of students together who maybe have a common interest or a common need, perhaps you have a group of students that are really working on figurative language, and you can pull them together and recommend a book to that one small group of students. It's just a different way to present books to children. We'll make sure that we share this article by Jennifer Saravello with you, so that if you'd like to read more about some of her ideas for engaging students in reading, you'll be able to do that. Another way you can have students do book talks are just recording them, having them just actually share their stories. We're not going to take the time to actually read or listen to this book talk today, but children can do this very young. So many students are used to recording themselves, especially after the pandemic, but they like to see themselves on videos. So these are things that you can record. And it's something older students can do as well, where they just share what it was that they read and how they felt about it.
Please book them.
Oh. And to just continue with the theme of book talks, some great ideas are coming in the chat as well, with using Flipgrid and book tasting. And so we're just sharing some other creative ways that you can also share book talks in your classroom too. And so making it just a part of your daily routine as well. So it could be that, maybe you start your day every day with a short book talk that either you or a student delivers. It could be at a staff meeting too, where a book talk is shared at the beginning of every single staff meeting, so that everybody's just being exposed to different books. And so this is another digital way that kids can use different softwares, and there's so many out there to create book recommendations, book talks for their peers, because as we know, as powerful as an adult or teacher book recommendation is, the power of students recommending books to other students is another great way.
Please book them. Allison and ready with
Those were created with puppet pails, by the way. So this was another one where students created digital book talks, and then using, at the time it was Erasma, but using that augmented reality where the book jacket cover was the trigger. And then another means of getting book talks into the hands of other students. And so these were also student created book talks. There's a lot of variations of these book bracket challenges, but this is a way that kind of raises the profile for reading, puts a focus on reading. Again, there's different ways that you can do it. So the focus isn't on the child reading, it's on the books that kids are in love with, again, whatever your theme might be. But again, it's about encouraging kids to read, and participating sometimes increases when there's a challenge. And this one was mentioned in the chat too, getting kids to read, getting them excited about a book and putting it into their hands. It could be that, I know sometimes people do like first chapter Fridays where they read the first chapter of a book to get kids hooked, or maybe some fabulous first lines. So just taking some of those really powerful opening lines of a book that would hook your readers. And then there's 1,000 different ways that you can recommend books to kids. And sometimes it can be as simple as just a bookmark. And if this is in the school library, if you have one, or even in your own library, just coming up with different ways of recommending books to kids, because again, the power of recommendation is really strong. And so these are just some different examples of ways that others have recommended books to their students via bookmarks or those little book tags underneath a bookshelf. And again, another way of just recommending. And so anything that just draws your eyes in. So this is a media specialist at an elementary school, but just having those, you know, even just the read me, or read me I'm funny, read me I'm mysterious, read me I'm scary. So just enough of a little something to hook or capture the attention of a student that might be walking by and browsing and might want to take that book. And again, just another way to bring awareness to different books that are in your collection. And this one you may or may not be familiar with, but oftentimes students will read a book and they love it, and then they might come up to you and say, you know, I really love this book. I loved Front Desk. Or do you have anything that you would recommend that would be similar to that? And so I used to tell my students that this is sort of the digital version of me when I can't be there for you. And so Novelist is a database of recommendations. And so it is free for you to access through mel.org. And it's just a great way to, if there's a book that you've already read, you can put it in there and it will give you some book recommendations that are similar to that. Or if you look along the left-hand side, sometimes students maybe don't have a specific book in mind, but they know that they love adventure stories, or they know that they love humorous stories. And so this resource would give some recommendations. Whether it's in your classroom library or school library might be another question, but it at least is a digital way of getting some recommendations and some new ideas into the hands of your kids.
So we really, regardless of which of these tools you're kind of thinking that you might like to use, we want to be thoughtful in the technology that we use. And we've just shared a bunch of ideas. And one thing that I just want to kind of reiterate as we think about the importance of keeping our students safe and secure. A lot of the pictures that we've shared today, we've made sure that we have permission to share those with you. But if you're a teacher who's maybe worried about permissions, I would suggest using Google Drive as a place to store your videos rather than maybe YouTube or an open system such as that. So putting them in Drive, you can still insert them into slide decks, and you can still use them in the same way you might do with a YouTube video, but you get to control who has access. Another idea is, and we'll share this in the chat with you, having a slide deck where students can share their book talks. So this is something where a student would put a picture of the book they're reading and then write the narrative over there on the left. And then if you were allowing students to share both good and bad reviews, they could use that thumbs up, they could turn that upside down and really help their classmates find books. You might also consider creating a website for your students where they share some of their maybe reading and writing that they're doing throughout the year. So here you can see books that Emma has read are included here. You could also, as a teacher, make a class website where your students could click on a student's name or picture and it would take them to that child's individual reading or writing portfolio. So just another idea. You could even make this a little bit more robust by having them share what they thought about each of these books, whether or not they liked it, whether or not they were looking for something from a different author or the same author, and you can start to see trends in a different way. It's just another idea there. You could also consider sharing YouTube videos from authors. So this particular video, again, we're not going to take the time to watch it today, but we'll make sure you have the links to everything. Christopher Paul Curtis, the author of Bud Not Buddy, shares what he enjoys about writing and kind of his process for writing. So it's a great one to really help students connect the fact that the book that they love was written by a real person. Another one is this video with Mo Willems, who's one of my favorite people in the whole world. But he shows how he draws Piggy to students so that they can also draw Piggy from the Elephant and Piggy books. So just quick little videos from the authors that show students, hey, you can be an author just like Mo Willems. It's not just an Elephant and Piggy book. It's an Elephant and Piggy book written by this real person. So it just helps to reinforce that idea.
And one of the nice things with social media is that we have access to a lot of these authors. And so don't underestimate reaching out to them and just asking. And so, for example, this is Leslie Connor. Our class had read her books and we reached out to her on Twitter and just asked if she would be willing to talk to our students. And she did. And she offered to do it for about 20 minutes. It ended up being much longer than that. But you know, if there is somebody that you're interested in, reach out to them and see if they'll talk to your class via technology at no cost.
And then when you're thinking about these videos and the authors and different ways that you might bring them into your classroom, consider what author you might highlight in your classroom. Who is it that your children in your class just can't get enough of? And then what opportunities exist? Judy gave that great example of something being a live interview that you might be able to do, or maybe just a Twitter chat or reaching out to them on social media in some way. And then what questions might you ask the students to consider while they're watching or engaging in that conversation? Just different things to keep in mind. We also want to make sure that our students have choice, and choice doesn't just apply to the specific title, but also choice in the kind of text they're engaging in. A lot of times I have to stop myself from calling it grab your book, because I know that there are different kinds of reading. And as a grown-up, a lot of times the readings that I do aren't a novel. So I want to make sure that we're giving students the chance to choose articles and short stories, poems, speeches, different kinds of writing that might appeal to them. If you're someone who used to use a Basil or an anthology, a lot of those stories that you maybe have fallen in love with but don't use anymore can be found free online. And I was just searching the title and seeing if you can find a PDF version of that story for your students.
And again, just to put a plug in for Mel, that if you're not familiar with Mel, I would highly recommend that you check it out. It is free for all Michigan residents, but as Michelle just mentioned, in getting our kids to read a variety of different types of texts, one of those, of course, is digital. And so there's a lot of resources out there that are accessed through mel.org that if you haven't, you might want to check out and have your students read.
So we think a lot about access. And when we think about access, what we really mean is just the ability to grab a book to read that interests you, something that you can and that you want to read. And there are many ways that this can happen, either in a classroom library or in a school library, but we want to make sure that students do have access to texts.
So one of the things just to think about is I often think about how do we as adults find material that we are interested in reading. And so thinking about whether it's a classroom library or a school library, but what is it that you can do so that kids are seeing things that are of interest to them and granting them greater access to it. And so thinking about searchability versus discoverability. And so oftentimes searching for something means you have to know what you're looking for. So I think about Amazon versus Barnes and Noble. If I'm at Amazon, I tend to be looking for something specific and I get just that one book. If I'm at Barnes and Noble, because of the way things are displayed, they're accessible, things are catching attention, things are labeled visually, that I end up walking out with 10 books. And so thinking about how you are setting up your library, be it again, classroom or school library, and arranging it in a way that's easy for kids to browse. And so thinking about it as a browsing library. And so putting books that are cover front forward. Michelle, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So this is Ben Court, who's a school librarian. But if you just kind of look at an overview of his collection, it's very browsable. It's very discoverable for kids. And some of the genres might not be traditional. They might be ones that are just of interest to kids. And so noticing that there is visual and text representation on the bins to capture kids' attention, a lot of forward-facing materials, a lot of reader-inspired categories, and there's representation built in there as well. And so it's a very discoverable library. And again, you can replicate this in your classroom as well.
Judy, one thing I really like about this is I don't see a single book level to be seen. It's all topics and interests. And I feel like that's so welcoming to a child.
I know that there's a lot of books in here that are catching my attention. And so these next few slides are just some examples. Again, lots of variations, but looking at it through the eyes of a child. And again, looking at the categories, looking at the visuals, the signage that's there, things that are just making it appealing to students, things that are capturing their attention, because sometimes that little tiny spine on the side of the book is not capturing their attention. But baseball, I can read the word and I see that visual baseball, that's capturing my attention, and will for students as well. And again, another just different methods that people are using to label their books. And so at the end of the day, you need to do what works for you. It might involve some organizing, reorganizing, a little bit of tweaking, having a system where if there's a method of putting things back on the shelf. And as a former classroom teacher and a former media specialist, I completely recognize the need and desire for oftentimes that Dewey Decimal. But at the end of the day, it's how can we capture kids' attention so that they're finding books that they want to read, or finding books that they didn't even know existed, but it captured their attention, and that book will lead to more books that they'll want to read.
And I think that's a really good point too, that idea of even just tapping into your library media specialist for ideas of books that they may want to read. Because I think a lot of times I'll go into a library and I will see just like the students would see those books on the top of the shelves, those ones that are kind of highlighted, but I might not know where to look for the other books. So really making sure that our students know that they can ask those questions if things aren't labeled quite that way just yet. And that might draw the attention to exactly what the interests are as well.
And, Michelle, on top of that too, if you're in a situation where perhaps you don't have a robust classroom library, but you are fortunate enough to have a school library, don't be shy about tapping into the media specialist to perhaps borrow 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 books for a period of time, because that's what they're there for. So if you're doing something in your classroom on a certain theme, or you just want to add some books of choice, again, tap into your school librarian, and they're happy to share their books with you and borrow them for periods of time, extended periods of time as well. And so again, just another example of how people have labeled bins in their collections.
And I even see like the Penguin book jumps right out at me, because I think about students who have interest levels. They may have a reading level that is at a certain point, but if they're interested in a topic, and I'm thinking about my own son right now, who could tell you everything there is to know about a penguin, he could have read a much more complex text about a penguin in first grade than he could have about a hummingbird or an eagle. So making sure that students know you don't have to necessarily always stay right where your reading level is. That's a tool for me as a teacher. The students don't really need to be hindered by that. We want them to read in their interest level.
Well, and the other thing too is that it's in designing it this way too, you're making it accessible for all readers. So for your multilingual learners, for also your students who are reluctant to read. By making them accessible in this way, you really are appealing to all your readers. And so this is just an example of a biography section, which biography in and of itself can be a genre, but think about how kids are asking for books in your collection. So that might be oftentimes like, I want an author, I'd like a musician, I'd like an entertainer. So just designing it around the needs of your kids. And if that's how kids are asking for books, that might be a starting point for how you display books in your library. So you're displaying them in the way that the kids are thinking about them. And then here's an example of a school that genreified, if you will, their nonfiction collection. And so by default, of course, the Dewey Decimal System is categorized, but again, thinking about how kids are looking for materials and then including that signage that is appealing to them. And so if you look on the right, where you see peoples and places, that was one of their categories. Everything's very labeled, but then to the right of that, it's just a reminder to say, well, if you like nonfiction books, look at these. And so they've got that visual representation just scattered and sprinkled throughout the entire library, just trying to capture kids' attentions. And it's flexible. These can change based on the needs of your kids. A lot of work, but it is flexible.
Well, and I think just the interest level, when I look at that weird stuff, I want to read everything in the weird stuff category. So just it's catching their attention like that. They may go to a genre or a group of books that they normally wouldn't have even considered.
So again, making it browsable. Finding space in your classroom that is just dead space and taking advantage of that and using that to promote books. So this is just one example. If you like this book, kind of like Novelist was that digital database of recommendations, can put some printed ones on some unused space in your classroom.
So when we think about all of these books that students have the chance to read, giving them chances to talk about what they're reading, those opportunities to engage in productive discourse is so important. Just the opportunity to talk about the pieces that they're reading and make connections to their real life, so important. But while they're chatting, some pieces that we can do as a teacher, because sometimes, especially in online learning, it can feel awkward when you're giving students time to chat. You might feel like, you know what, I'm not really sure what to do with myself during that time. I don't want to interrupt them, but I don't want to ignore them either. Here are some things that teachers can do while the students are engaging in that discourse. You can be listening for focused conversations. Are the students staying on topic? Do they maybe need a little bit of a redirection? Are they referencing the text? This is where I think about the citing textual evidence. Are they saying, I liked this book because, or this happened in the story? Super important and helps prepare them for later learning as well. Are they engaged in listening skills? Are they showing off their listening skills? Are they being good listeners? We want to make sure students know about this, know how to do it. Being a good listener is an important skill. Use of talk stems. This is great for our multilingual learners as well. If we have some talk stems around the classroom that help them get started so that they're not just kind of wondering what to say or not sure what to say, or they get stuck. This can be done. And then correcting any misconceptions that you might hear during the talk is also important. But any one of these bullets can become a mini lesson during your reader's workshop or during your reading time. One of the most important things I think that we do as reading teachers is help students determine whether or not a text is a good fit for them. Not every text is a good fit. There are genres that are more difficult, but there are texts sometimes that just don't grab our attention. And we want to make sure that we're helping our students differentiate between books that they have to read because there's a task associated with it. But when they have their own choice, is this particular text a good fit for you? Why or why not? Helping students do that is really important. And then when we think about the overall benefits of independent reading, when we provide that time, and not just the time, but really thoughtfully designing that time, it can improve comprehension, which of course, I mean, it's not a rocket science to know that if students are engaged in reading, they're going to become better readers. So we'll improve their comprehension. They will develop vocabulary skills at a much higher rate when they're exposed to vocabulary. So that time for independent reading is a great chance for them to learn new vocabulary terms. It improves fluency, but also prosody, that ability to read with expression and at the right rate, so important for our students. It also can expose students to background knowledge of a range of important cultural and historical events. And I put an asterisk there, and I put an asterisk there because in order for that last bullet to be true, we have to have titles in our library that do that. So if we're only allowing students to read books that are about people who look and sound and live like they do, they're not building that robust background knowledge that they might otherwise. Doesn't mean that it's not important for students to see themselves in text. It absolutely is. But we want to make sure we're balancing that and providing them opportunities to read about science phenomenon and historical events as well. When we think about that idea, whatever it is that we're doing in our classroom, we want to make sure that we're providing sound instruction. So some guiding principles for instruction. We always want to just think about the purpose. What is it that our students are working toward? We know that we want to make our students into lifelong readers, but we also have specific learning goals that apply to an individual child. So what is the goal, and how does this time of independent reading help them meet that goal? Authenticity. Does the work that I'm asking students to do happen in the real world? I don't know about you, but never once since I've been an adult has anyone ever asked me to read an article and fill out a worksheet. Not one time. But I think about all the times in my own classroom where that was the task. Read this and then answer these 5 questions. So we want to make sure that we're giving them authentic opportunities to engage. And people do in real life, read texts and talk about them. Hey, I read this newspaper article. What do you think? Do you agree with that? Or I heard this speech. What do you think? So we want to give students authentic opportunities to share. Choice. Do students have opportunities to make choices about what they're reading, where to read it, and with whom? I think back again to my own early teaching experience when I felt like I wasn't a good teacher unless I had complete control, and how I wish I could go back in time and just release a lot of that control. It doesn't matter if the students are reading at their desk or if they're reading on the floor behind the teacher's desk, or if they're reading under their desk. Give them choice about where to read, and maybe sometimes even with whom they're reading. Can we let them partner read or share in a different way? But making sure that they have lots of choices. Doesn't mean that we don't put any structures in place or that we don't sometimes ask everyone to read the same text, but whenever possible, giving them those opportunities to make choices. And then that idea of explicit instruction. How will I show students what I need them to be able to do? So making sure that we as teachers are modeling those skills and then providing opportunities for students to do them as well. So that's where that gradual release model really comes into play. Letting them see what it looks like and then practicing together and then on their own. As we think about all the places we can go for resources that really help build that background knowledge and help give students choice, a lot of our students are drawn to nonfiction, yet we know that many of our classroom libraries, this is where we have the smaller selection. So one thing that I just want to make sure that you're aware of is that we do have on our lln.risa.net site a Talking Science Through Text resource for you. These were actually designed to be read alouds, but all of the titles here are aligned to the NGS standards, and they are done by grade level, and you can use them as read alouds or put them in your classroom library for students to check out and look at. We just wanted you to know that this exists. So if you're looking at really great books that can help build that science-y part of your classroom library, please check this out. We also want to think about what research says. Whenever someone asks us to adjust our classroom schedule or to incorporate some new practice or just to validate what it is that we're doing in our classroom, we want to look at research. And so when we think about what research really says about independent reading, I'm going to give you just a selection to read. We'll take about 4 minutes to read this. If you prefer to read this on a different screen where you can make it bigger, Judy will drop the link to the entire article in the chat. Just give you a few minutes to read what research says about independent reading.
Some ideas, Michelle, are starting to trickle in. So the first one is just increasing engagement and motivation, allowing for more autonomy. And having more engaging books for kids to read by building on their interests. Choice and voice.
Love that. It's just another reminder, like if your classroom library looks the same that it did 10 years ago, we probably need to update it with some of the new content that students are interested in.
And a few others, building time into this schedule for quiet reading time and letting kids choose their own books creates engagement from the start. Classroom libraries allow kids to exercise some control, which is powerful. And again, that ready access to books.
So important. If you're someone who is wondering how you can gain access to books in your classroom, please reach out to us. We don't have all the answers, but we're more than willing to brainstorm with you and try and find some ways to get some text into your classroom. So if that's something you're struggling with. And of course, I feel like all roads lead back to that library and really tapping into, if you're fortunate enough to have a library or a media center in your building, tapping into those people who run it so that you can find out what they're thinking and what resources you might be able to use. Great. So thinking about what stuck out to you. So this idea of really applying practices that we're sharing today and that you're sharing in the chat. Lots of great ideas have already been shared. So thank you. And as we finish up here, please feel free to add those ideas into the chat as we continue. We know that independent reading is important, but we also know that gone are the days of the teacher grading papers or, taking attendance or finishing lunch or whatever may have been done maybe in our childhood while students independently read. It's not just a time to take care of maybe the problems that maybe arose during recess. It's time to really engage in reading instructions. We want to make sure that we're scaffolding that independent reading so that students can be supported in the way that they need to be supported. So we want to make sure that we're modeling and teaching students to self-select books and that they can read them from a variety of genres. We want to make sure that students have so many opportunities to read different kinds of things. We should be holding reading conferences. We talk about their reading goals and how they're meeting it. This is a time when you can really talk about the things that students are choosing to read and start nudging them forward, helping them to make choices that will help them reach their reading goals. And then that gets back into that formative assessment piece where you're providing formative assessments in the moment so that you're able to monitor and provide feedback as to what students really need. And then we want students to be accountable for their reading. This does not need to be an old school reading log or something to that effect. Instead, it could be those videos where students are sharing with other students what books they liked, what books they didn't like. It could be just a digital database of pictures of the covers of the books that they've read, so that when they think about what they've done as a reader in your classroom this year, they're able to see, wow, look at all these books that I read. I'm pretty amazing. And that will help them start to see themselves as successful readers and writers, which is what we want. So we want them not only just to keep track of the books, but to jot down a few words about each one. Was this something you would recommend? Why or why not? Is this a book we'd go back to? Who else might like this book? This is also something you can share with families when they come for conferences or when they ask you how their child is doing in reading. You can share the books that they're choosing to read. See if the books that they're reading at home, if those are different or the same as the ones they're reading in school. So it's just a way to start really seeing connections between our students and the books they choose. We have included a list of resources on this in the slide deck. And we did this because one, we always want to give credit to the people that we're pulling ideas from, but also we would encourage you to maybe go back and dive into some of these articles and really pick out new ideas. Perhaps you'll find different pieces that you just want to highlight and bring into your classroom this year than we chose. So we have that for you. And we want to thank you for coming today.